I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to another episode of the China Global Podcast. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. China has never condemned the invasion, and its government and media have carefully avoided using the term Ukraine war, opting instead to refer to the war as the Ukraine crisis, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or even the special military operation, a term that echoes Moscow's language. Beijing's approach to the Ukraine war has included support for Russia, a commitment to China's own principles, including respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a professed desire for peace. Today, we're going to discuss China's evolving posture toward the war and China's relationship with Ukraine. And I'm delighted to have as my guest today, Dr. Vita Golod, who is a junior research fellow at the Krimsky Institute of Oriental Studies, which is in the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And she's also a visiting adjunct instructor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's also co-founder of the Ukrainian Platform for Contemporary China and a board member of the Ukrainian Association of Sinologists. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Vita.
Thank you for inviting me, Bonnie.
So let's start. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of background briefly on what the nature was of China's relationship with Ukraine before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What were the areas of cooperation and the focus of the strategic partnership?
Well, it's a very popular question. I even published an article for journal Contemporary China explaining the drama behind the Sino-Ukrainian relations right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I have defined it 5 stages of Sino-Ukrainian relations. And of course, at the beginning, both sides wanted to see productive cooperations for the year ahead, and Ukraine wanted to have really balanced foreign policy involving in political discourse with all parts of the world and East, of course, and China represented the leader of the East for Ukraine. And China wanted to have some leverage in post-Soviet countries. And of course, China was interested in Ukraine's agriculture sector and metallurgical base, and also geographical location as well. So it was absolutely mutual interest. Before, I would say, 2005, it was marked by 3 high-level visits by Chinese presidents to Kiev, 5 high-level visits by Ukrainian presidents to China. In 2005, we have Viktor Yushchenko president, and he wasn't interested in China at all. He was absolutely pro-Western, I would say, president. He wanted to develop this American-Western vector in foreign relationship. And of course, he never visited China. And that time, I would say we had the first pause in political dialogue between Ukraine and China. And the very interesting, the next period, Viktor Yanukovych presidency, he was absolutely shame for Ukraine and the whole history of Ukrainian relations. He fled from Ukraine, is hiding in Russia somewhere at the moment, but he succeeded in signing 2 the most important agreements between Ukraine and China. The first one is the 2011 Joint Declaration of Strategic Partnership, and the second one, 2013 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation. And since then, what is the most interesting, both sides refer to each other as a strategic partners, even now. So before the invasion, the 4th period of relationship started in 2014 with Poroshenko presidency and next Zelenskyy presidency. Before the invasion, we had, I would say, a political chill or political distancing, but China became Ukraine's the largest trading partner. So that period I can characterize as a trading relationship. And of course, it was important, and it's still important, to have this bridge between the countries. And I would say trade remains this relationship going.
So, about a year ago, I remember I was attending the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, and Ukrainian President Zelensky openly criticized China for the first time. He was actually there in person, and Zelensky accused China of seeking to undermine the peace talks that were planned to take place and providing Chinese components for Russian weaponry. And then this past April, President Zelensky charged China with supplying artillery and gunpowder to the Russian Federation. So, why is Zelensky speaking out now? And have his statements had any impact on Chinese policy?
It hasn't had any real impact, to be honest. And I still remember that moment clearly. It was right before President Zelensky peace summit in Jeddah. And I know that he and his team had worked really hard to invite a Chinese representative to attend. However, instead of sending Li Hui or any other delegate, China announced its joint six-point position with Brazil, launching an alternative platform called the Friends of Peace. And from my perspective, it was absolutely perfectly designed for the countries of the global south, showing that China is a reliable mediator in this conflict. However, Zelensky didn't like it. Zelensky was mad, and from his perspective, he saw this as an attempt by China to undermine his efforts to bring as many countries as possible to join his peace formula. And China didn't send anybody to that peace summit, explaining that from Chinese perspective, both sides need to sit at the same table and negotiate. And of course, at the time, Zelensky didn't want this, any direct negotiations with Russia. And Zelensky started to criticize China recently again. And of course, we have a lot of intelligence information about China's support of Russia and about Chinese citizens participate in this war on Russia's side. And two of those Chinese got in Ukraine's captivity and was widely represented by Ukrainian media. And this situation I can explain as Ukraine's attempt to find a right approach to the Trump administration, perhaps even aligning somewhat with US rhetoric in the context of the Sino-American rivalry. However, he still remains very cautious when it comes to any mentioning of China or President Xi Jinping.
How would you describe Kyiv's interest in its relationship with China today? And what's been the reaction in Ukraine, not only at the government level, but also in the public, to what you described as China's claimed neutrality or its ambiguity regarding the invasion, and of course its support for Russia's defense industry and therefore its ability to continue to prosecute the war?
Yes, absolutely. So at the level of top officials, I mean the level of president and his government, there is a strong desire to keep diplomacy with China working. There is no hope anymore that Xi Jinping will influence Putin to pull his troops out of Ukraine. However, President Zelensky has many reasons not to make China an enemy, especially given that China hasn't supplied Russia with lethal weapons or troops, at least so far. And both sides refer to each other as strategic partners. And it looks like slow diplomatic dance, but it's important to keep communications going. And the next level is intellectual level. And we have a real interest in engaging with China through public diplomacy. And me and my colleagues traveled to China last year, and we had conversations with Chinese professors at Fudan, at Beida, at Tsinghua universities. And what is my observation? Chinese side remains cautious, especially when it comes to any political sensitive topics, discourse about this war, and they don't want to criticize Russia publicly. And of course, in private conversations, they were more open, but it doesn't work like that. So still, we need to build to promote this public diplomacy, and public diplomacy could also play a significant role in the future Sino-Ukrainian relations. And the next level, the third level, is ordinary Ukrainians. And we know that our society is very proactive, and Ukrainians are going through extremely difficult times. That's why people need anything that brings a real positive impact on their lives. And Chinese position on Ukraine is very confusing for them. They don't want to know anything about 5 principles of peaceful coexistence or any academic explanation on China's stance on Ukraine. They need real results. And at the beginning of this war, President Zelenskyy, Xi Jinping publicly said that China could play a role, a humanitarian leader. And China provided us with 1.5 million worth of humanitarian aid in March 2022, and that's it. We extremely appreciate, we are grateful for this help, but it's not a position of leader. So the ordinary Ukrainians see China as a hostile country. We had 2 public opinion polls, and of course, from ordinary Ukrainians' perspective, Chinese position on Ukraine is pro-Russian, definitely not pro-Ukrainian. That's why there is a big, deep mistrust toward China in Ukrainian society.
What's the view in Ukraine about the China-Russia relationship? You know, there's been this ongoing debate in the United States and elsewhere in Europe too, among experts as to whether or not there could be the possibility of somehow driving a wedge between Putin and Xi Jinping, or introducing some friction or imposing some limits in that relationship. Do you believe that the policies of the United States and other countries could in any way influence the China-Russia relationship?
So, replying to your first question, the Sino-Russian relations are seen as a security threat for Ukraine and for Europe as a whole. And the Ukrainian leadership can accept their bilateral relationship as neighbors and even economic integration, especially in light of the many opportunities that have emerged after the withdrawal of European companies from Russia. However, any support for Russia's war machine military industry is a red line of Ukraine. And Ukraine will always seek to sanction such activity, working closely with its international allies, including the United States. So Washington's support is very important in this domain, and Ukrainian diplomats are working hard to find the right approach to Trump administration. We'll know that. So for the United States, we all know that the Trump administration views China as a primary adversary, not just a rival or strategic competitor, as it was under the Biden administration. So China is likely to continue its current rapprochement with Russia, focusing on its own national interests, buying cheap resources and deepening ties through platforms like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, conducting military drills in different regions. And Russia, in turn, may find an opportunity to restore its relationship with Washington under Trump. Especially, we can see how soft Trump is when he speaks about Putin or Russia. And it's definitely show us that Trump wants to make a deal with Russia. However, China will almost certainly remains Moscow's top priority due to both ideological alignment and strategic calculation and this period of convenience against the Western camp, I would say. And it's important to know that Sino-Russian relations are mostly the relations of leaders because they met more than 40 times and they know each other very well, understand other's strengths and weaknesses, and they know what to expect. Of course, there are a lot of different angles of this relationship, and there is a mistrust and historical context as well. But I don't think that Russia really trusts President Trump and probably sees him as very unpredictable president. So I don't see any possibility of split of Sino-Russian relationship, at least so far. So Russia will act proactively. It's clearly that Russia will try to find opportunity how to benefit more from this presidency in Washington. And what is the biggest Ukrainian concern? It may try to offer a mineral deal or other strategic leverage to Trump. Compared to Ukraine, Russia simply has more to offer, and it could play badly with American support to Ukraine.
You recently published an article in the South China Morning Post, and I'll quote a sentence from that and ask you about it. You wrote, China's building its image as a peacemaker and mediator in the Russia-Ukraine and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts using familiar tactics and instruments that are consistent with its long-standing foreign policy principles. So, what steps has China taken to build its image as a peacemaker in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Again, the 12-point position paper announced by China in February 2023, also the shuttle diplomacy led by Li Hui, China's special envoy in the political settlement in Ukraine. He traveled to Kiev, Beijing, and Europe twice. And the third round of his diplomacy was to the Global South, where he announced another 6-point position paper jointly with Brazil in May 2024. Also, I'd like to mention the press conferences of the China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where China's spokespersons repeatedly said that China remains an objective and balanced stance on Ukraine. So China is trying to offer its platform for negotiation, its own political settlement, which is peace through negotiation or political settlement through the dialogue, insisting that the security concern of both sides must be respected. Also, what is important, China says that it respects Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence, and it definitely helps to keep diplomacy working. So this strategy offers China a degree of flexibility. So Chinese diplomacy is very flexible without getting deeply involved in their conflict resolution. That's why, as I said, China's stance on Ukraine is very confusing for ordinary Ukrainians. And now President Trump took the lead in their political settlement in Ukraine using the same formula, which is peace through negotiation. It doesn't work so far, but what is the biggest concern of all Ukrainians? Neither China nor the current US leadership understand what is the difference between Russia and Ukraine mean by peace.
So I think most Russia experts say that Vladimir Putin doesn't want to end the war. I think some people think that China would benefit from a ceasefire, an end to the war in which Russia doesn't win everything. Ukraine still continues to be a sovereign nation, but maybe smaller than it is today. Maybe other people might argue that China doesn't have an interest in ending the war. So what's your view on that?
I think Russia is China is taking sideline and watching about the development, and China has never played any significant role in mediation, at least, as I said, sending Li Hui and promoting this peace platform, which perfectly plays for its own image as a reliable stakeholder or very reliable partner for the global South countries. In Ukraine, we didn't feel any result of this mediation, of this shuttle diplomacy. And from my perspective, it plays perfectly with China's image, but nothing else. So, and China, of course, is interested to restore economic corridors in Ukraine for supplying Chinese goods to Europe, to have economic engagement with European countries, with Ukraine as well. As I said, Ukraine is the largest China is the largest trading partner for Ukraine. However, we have negative trade balance, so we still need to increase our exports to China. And China is interested in, as I said, in agricultural potential, in metallurgical base. So there is a room for cooperation. And of course, we have academic exchange. We have students. 40% of all foreign students in Ukraine are Chinese. So it's important to keep these channels open as well.
What actions could China take if it truly wanted to establish peace in Ukraine? Is there some litmus test you have in mind that if China were really serious, that it could do something concrete?
Oh, it's a very difficult question. So, as I said, China cares only about its own interests. And in this Sino-American rivalry, Ukraine took American side, took Western side. And I heard many times from my Chinese colleagues, there is no room for China because of the United States. And it's a part of our survival, of course, as a nation, as a sovereign state. So the United States helped us a lot with military and humanitarian aid. And at this moment, we really we really need any kind of help from China, from European Union, because with Trump presidency, Ukraine became even more vulnerable. So from my perspective, probably it's a good moment for China to step in and to show again its interest in peace building in Ukraine and probably to be more involved in political dialogue. So, and it's also important to say that Ukraine is building its EU future. And it's a big team, is working hard every day to get our final goal to become a member of the European Union. And from my perspective, their membership in EU will give us more leverage in our partnership with China. So it's our final goal. It's now our final destination, and we need all kind of source of help to reach this goal.
Even as the war continues, there's a discussion that is germinating about the possibility of plans for reconstruction of Ukraine and for China potentially to play a role. And recently, a spokesman for the China International Development Cooperation Agency, Li Ming, he expressed that China would provide assistance in the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine in accordance with the wishes of the parties involved. Very vague statement, but I think expressing some interest in playing a role. This is probably quite controversial. It certainly is controversial in Europe. I've talked to experts in Europe, and I think many people are wary about China coming in with large amounts of money in Belt and Road projects to reconstruct infrastructure and other things in Ukraine. But I'm curious what that discussion looks like in Ukraine? Are people interested in China playing a role in reconstruction? Do they see downsides? Are there risks, and if so, are the risks bigger than the benefits?
Oh, it's really a popular question because Ukraine's needs of recovery and reconstruction are enormous. According to the World Bank, it's over the $500 billion Ukraine needs for like future reconstruction and recovery. But the good point is the reconstruction in Ukraine is going on. It's never stopped. And I can bring my favorite example, Mykolaiv city in the south of Ukraine, between Kherson and Odessa. It was heavily destroyed in 2022. And the mayor of Mykolaiv managed how to restore, how to rebuild the critical infrastructure. So this city is functioning pretty well right now. And now he's working on wind farm project. Can you imagine that wind farm not far from the front line? And he's working really hard to attract in more donors to join this project. So probably it's a good moment for Chinese companies because he really needs funding this project to finish it up in a short-term perspective. And another my favorite example, Taiwan. Taiwan helped to rebuild jointly with Lithuanian government, not directly, but helped to rebuild kindergarten and school in Bucha and Borodyanka. And that contribution was widely covered by Ukrainian media, and it played well with Taiwanese image in Ukraine. So what I want to say that China can step in every single moment. So I don't think, given all these needs, that Ukraine will put any barrier in Chinese participation. And what is also important to say that Ukraine reconstruction is like mixed bag back from different approaches. So we have private funding, government funding, loans, grants. So what China wants to use, it's possible. And engaging in national level or regional level, it's very welcome. As I say, with Mykolaiv or with Kyiv officials, please. And as you just mentioned, BRI framework, it's also good point because as we know, China wants to acts through a BRI framework. And even though Ukraine signed their BRI memorandum in 2017, it was never deeply involved in this initiative because of the different reason, because of the war, because of their different scandals. Even we had couple of projects were implemented in Ukraine. Some of them were successfully implemented, another finished in court, but we still have this like interaction and branch office of the big state Chinese companies in Kyiv. So from my perspective, Ukraine has to articulate clearly, publicly, what is the future of BRI in Ukraine, to give this signal message to Chinese side that we are welcoming Chinese investments and we are welcoming Chinese participation in Ukraine reconstruction now, not somewhere in the future, because this war is far from over.
The relationship between China and Ukraine, you emphasize, I think, quite a bit. It seems to me that one of the major variables that will shape that relationship is the war and how it continues, but that economically there seems to be a big demand from Ukraine. So is the economic factor the most important variable that will affect Ukraine's relationship with China going forward? And what kind of relationship with China would best serve Ukraine's interests?
It is a very good question. And if you had asked me this question 1 or 2 years ago, I would have said that Ukraine was eager to receive nuclear security guarantees from China. After all, we have a joint declaration and we have a treaty of friendship, which could serve perfectly as a legitimate basis for such a role. I also would have said that China could serve as a guarantor of food security, as it was the largest beneficiary of the grain from Ukraine initiative. But in 2025, it's clear that China is not willing to step up on any issue. And in response to your question, I honestly don't know what will be the future of the Ukraine for Sino-Ukrainian relations, and I don't know how Ukraine's broader foreign policy will look like, because it simply depends on the outcome of this war and also on our negotiations with the European Union. As I've said before, EU membership is vital for our survival as a nation. And it will bring us some leverage in our foreign affairs, but also will introduce some limitations. And our relationship with the United States, it's another story, but it will also serve as an external factor, which definitely will influence our foreign policy. China. China remains Ukraine's largest foreign trade partner. And as you mentioned just now, it will likely remain the primary bridge between our countries because we heavily rely on import from China for our armed forces, for our civilian use, for energy sector, and many, many more. And now we are working hard to increase our export to China because we have a negative trade balance. And more attention should be given to exporting finished goods, not just raw materials. So it's like ongoing work. Academic and students exchanges, along with people-to-people ties, would serve perfectly as another bridge between our two countries and could definitely strengthen our relationship. When it comes to political relations, I see no sign of a breakthrough in a short-term perspective, unfortunately. China has clearly placed Russia on the top of its diplomatic hierarchy. And as I mentioned earlier, we perceive this as a security threat. So President Xi Jinping has never traveled to Kiev, and it's unlikely that President Zelenskyy will be invited to Beijing anytime soon. So, what is the most frustrating, I've been told many times, that Xi Jinping doesn't take Zelenskyy seriously, and it's simply waiting for a leadership change in Kiev. And of course, it's another indicator of the Russian influence over China, because it's definitely Russia's narrative. And still, public diplomacy. Ukraine is strongly committed to the public diplomacy. We want to communicate with our Chinese counterparts to avoid misunderstanding between two nations. And we need definitely to identify more areas where we could cooperate.
I've been talking with Dr. Vita Golod, who is a junior research fellow at the Krymsky Institute of Oriental Studies in Ukraine. Thanks so much for joining us, Vita.
Thank you for having me.